Hi guys, we are working on section 6.2 on page 217. We are looking at theorems 6.4 through 6.8. I'm just going to do some diagrams to give you guys a visual for what each of these theorems is talking about. So theorem 6.4 says complements of congruent angles are congruent. So here I have two congruent angles, A and B. We are going to talk about their complements. Complementary angles when added up together equal 90 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this. And I'm going to draw this. And these are each 90 degree angles. So we know that this, we'll call this angle 1, we'll call this angle 2. Okay, so we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. If that's true, and when both of these added together they equal 90 degrees, then we can also say that this angle is going to be congruent to this angle. Because angle 2 plus angle 4 is going to be 90 degrees, and angle 1 plus angle 3 is going to be 90 degrees. If angle 1 is equal to angle 2, then angle 3 has to be equal to angle 4, making them congruent. Okay? 6.5 is the angle congruence, or it says angle congruence is an equivalence relation. So here I have two congruent angles, angles 1 and 2. We know that if two angles are congruent, then they are equal. So since angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, then we know that the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 2. Okay. 6.6 is the adjacent angle sum theorem. If two adjacent angles are congruent to another pair of adjacent angles, then the larger angles formed are congruent. So what I did is I went ahead and I drew some congruent angles here. I have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Sorry, I want to make sure I have all the words in front of me when I'm doing this so I can follow along. Okay, so if two adjacent angles are congruent to another pair of adjacent angles, so we have angles 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. These are 1 and 3 are adjacent angles. They are next to each other and they share a side. 2 and 4 are also adjacent. They are next to each other and they share a side. If these two angles are congruent to another pair of angles, which they are, we have angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 and 3 is congruent to angle 4, then the larger angles formed are also congruent. Okay, so since these two are equal to these two larger angles are equal to one another. And that's the adjacent angle sum theorem. When we add these up, sum is adding. When we add up two adjacent angles, with two other, and we compare it to two other adjacent angles that are congruent, the larger angles are congruent. Okay. 6.7, adjacent angle portion theorem. So a portion means a part of. So if two angles, one in each of two pairs of adjacent angles are congruent, so I went ahead and I drew that out. I have, trying to see where I can put this so we can see the words and the picture at the same time. I'll do it here like this. If two angles, one in each pair of two adjacent angles, so I have, here's my angles 1 and 3, 2 and 4. I have one pair here, 1 and 2 are congruent to each other. And the larger angles, A, B, C, and D, E, F, are congruent to each other. Then the other two angles are also congruent. So if 1 and 2 are congruent, and A, B, C, and E, F, G are congruent, then 3 has to be congruent to 4. This right here is kind of like, therefore, then this is true. Okay, that's also 3 dots mean. Okay, whole angle is congruent to the whole angle. This part is congruent to this part, which means that these two have to be congruent. Adjacent angle portion theorem. All right, then we have the last one, which is 6.8, congruent angle bisector theorem. If two congruent angles are bisected, the 4 resulting angles are congruent. So here I drew angle M and angle N. Here I have MB as a bisector, and then I have ND as a bisector for angle N over here. If these are bisectors, then angles 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all going to be equal because these two angles are equal. So that means that the measure of angle 1 is congruent to the measure of angle 2, which is congruent to the measure of angle 3, which is congruent to the measure of angle 4. And that's our 4 congruent angles. And that's just that's an overview of what the different theorems mean.